Welcome back.
Welcome back, family, to Hear Us Out. I'm Renee.
I'm Gary.
Thank you so much to our longtime subscribers who've been with us since the very beginning. And if you're new here, make sure to hit the subscription button so that you can continue to get notifications to hear us out.
Yes, thank you. And on this episode, we will be reading chapter 9 and analyzing chapter 9
Right.
of Plato's Republic. This is our penultimate episode
Mm-hmm.
on Plato's Republic.
Uh-huh.
That's 10 episodes, 10
Books.
chapters in
Yep.
all. He calls them books.
Right.
So, yes, and in our last episode, Plato talked about the different constitutions.
Right.
And the different types of men that these particular constitutions or forms of government produces.
Right.
It was the democracy of the Laconian constitution, which led into oligarchy, which led into democracy, which led into tyranny.
And have aristocracy, which is the best of
the best. But yes, but that's outside.
That's outside of those four.
Outside of those four, yeah. And the very last thing that Socrates talks about is how a democratic government becomes a tyrannical government. And in this book, at the very beginning, he continues this discussion and he begins to talk about how a democratic man becomes a tyrannical man. Right. In the last episode, we talked about how all these different forms of governments rise in defense of the former.
Right.
Oligarchy rises as a defense of democracy. And democracy rises as defense of oligarchy, and tyranny rises
as defense of democracy.
Yes. And in each phase, when he talks about these different forms of government, he really wants to talk about the type of people, the type of men that these types of governments produces and that houses these men. And that is, critical, moreover than those forms of constitutions themselves, because Plato has a preoccupation, if you would say.
That's a good word.
A preoccupation with control.
Yes, definitely.
Right, and we saw in how he discusses democracy, tyranny, and oligarchy, and just practically all these governments, is that they do not have sufficient control of themselves and of the people inside of them to ensure the overall health and safety of the city, of the society as a whole. Right, and that does not change when he begins to discuss the tyrannic man. That's how he calls it, the tyrannic man. Right, and literally, the very first sentence says, "What is left now to examine," said I, "is the tyrannic man himself, how he arises out of the democratic, and what his character is, and how he lives, whether wretched or in bliss." That is literally how it all starts off. And he says, really to go into it here, he says, "Yes, by all means. See here, this is what I want to look into about them. I feel that some of the unnecessary desires and pleasures are lawless. They are born in everyone, it is true, but when they are chastened by the laws and the better desires with reason's help, some people can get rid of them wholly, but only a few remain and weak, although in others they are more and strong." So that's where we talk about Plato's preoccupation with control. Right, and on this show, we've often talked about self-control. About being able to, control yourself and your actions and tempering your actions in the awareness that, you have to share society with everyone. Right? What Plato is talking about here, he isn't talking necessarily about self-control. Right? We've talked about how Plato has a very top-down view of society. That change is implemented from the top down, from the rulers down, from the government down. And even then, he is examining humanity through the lens of government. He says that a city is akin to a man's soul. Right? So in analyzing these things, he's analyzing humanity. So trying to perfect society, in a sense, is him trying to perfect the man. Right? But that's not something that self-control cannot be imposed. You can't impose control. That in and of itself is tyranny.
Yes.
Plato may talk about, that the type of control he's trying to impose. But that entails tyranny. Like, he's talked about many a times before and all the types of government and stuff like that, even with his aristocracy, that he's trying to impose a particular worldview. But his imposition is for the greater good.
Right.
For the greater good of the city and the health of the city as a whole. Because he literally says here that I feel that some of the unnecessary desires and pleasures are lawless. They are born in everyone, it is true, but when they are chastened by the laws and the better desires with reason's help, some people can get rid of them wholly, or only a few remain and weak, although in others they are more and stronger. He's literally talking about the law implementing the type of control he wants to see in people personally. Right? And that is what we would call tyranny.
Yeah. Because the laws constrict. It doesn't allow for choice or for freedom per se. And as we've talked about extensively, is that with Plato and with Socrates, and in looking at these issues and looking at the city from a top down perspective, is that the success, I'm gonna say successes, and I'm using it in quotations, okay? That the successes of the city, okay, is all incumbent on the top. But any shortcomings and failures is because of the bottom. Not understanding that if the successes are at the top, then you have to own the failures of the bottom because it's you at the top who are making all of the decisions, the ones who's doing all of the imposing. And so that's the thing I think that has been, if we've questioned, throughout this, throughout the reading here, is that, that's the thing that Plato seems to miss. He seems to miss that people are people and that they have emotions, that they have feelings, that they can change their minds. And trying to create a society which is so mathematical, so scientific, to where you think you're only going to produce a particular kind of people because of what you have imposed, is, I don't know. I don't think that's very smart thinking.
So we can all understand Plato's, predilection.
Yes.
What Plato wants to create. The world that he's trying to create. But that's the thing, is that you can't impose order. You can only achieve it. You achieve order. Anything else is a failure. Anything else, as we call it, will be tyranny.
Right.
But how he says is that it's the rule of one, right? The rule of one, that's a tyranny. What Plato is trying to do, and then what he's talked about later on in this, is what Plato is trying to do is he's trying to create the perfect system where everyone is where they need to be to best be able to contribute to the health of the whole. He is trying to perfect it, trying to perfect society, trying to make sure it's done in the best way possible with the best people possible. Right? But when Plato himself, Socrates himself, has said in previous chapters that the best people are the guardians. The best people are your rulers. And that it is through the bravery of your rulers that a city becomes brave, that a people become brave. Right? Through the bravery of your warriors, through the wisdom of your leaders. That's what makes a city wise. So if you have a culture that has, like we said many a times before, that has prioritized its guardians, its warriors, and its rulers. If you have a city that its entire culture prioritizes one group, how is that anything but oligarchy?
Right.
How is that anything but tyranny?
Right.
The rule of one group prioritizing the needs of one group over everything else. Well, we're going to dive into that idea a little later, because there's this whole argument that Plato, at least this distinction that Plato was making between the tyrant and the king.
Right.
And we're going to explore a little later on. But right now, he's talking about the tyrannic man. He's talking about literally, how the tyrannic man is produced. And he says this: he is led into complete lawlessness, which those leading him call liberty. His father and the rest of the family support these intermediate desires, but his leaders again support the other side. When these terrible magicians and tyrant makers see no hope of holding the young man in any other way, they contrive to implant in him some passion to be the protector of his idle and spendthrift desires, a huge wicked drone. What else is the ruling passion in such men? Nothing else, he said, just that. Now the other desires come buzzing around the huge drone, laden with incense and perfumes and garlands and wines, and the dissolute pleasures which are found in such companies, magnifying and nursing him to the uttermost, and they implant in him a sting of unsatisfied craving. Then this protector of the soul takes madness for his bodyguard and runs wild. If he finds any opinion or desires in himself accounted honest and modest, he slays them and casts them out of himself, until he has purged himself of temperance and filled himself with foreign frenzy. So basically what he's talking about is that loss of control. He characterized democracy as this lack of discipline and this lack of understanding of what is best for everyone. Right? Everybody just wants to do what they want.
Right.
That leads to a lack of discipline in the soul of the people. And they turn to tyranny when their leaders of the day cannot provide them with the freedom that they've grown accustomed to, or that they believe they've grown accustomed to, but the freedom that they believe they're owed. Right? So when a person loses that control, loses the reason and all the things that he says that makes a person honest and modest in his own words, when a person loses those things, they turn to tyranny because they have become enslaved entirely and utterly to their desires. They prioritize their freedom, their desires over anything and everything else. And when that happens, you get tyranny, right? Because you have a democracy that prioritizes freedom but fails to deliver that freedom, right? And then so the individual, the man, feels that he must protect his own freedom from the failures of his leaders, which leads to him prioritizing his own freedom over everything else, which leads to that person becoming a tyrant in and of themselves, because they are not tempering their actions, for the health of the city as a whole. That doesn't factor into him. There is no temperance, no honesty, no modesty. There is only his desire, and only achieving those desires, even if it comes at the cost of everything else. And that's what he begins to explore later on, right? That's what he begins to explore later on. And when he talks about how this person, in his slavish pursuits of his desires, ends up, abusing his parents.
Yeah.
And the way he talks about it is that, how that is one of the greatest wrongs that a person can ever do is abuse his elders, abuse those who know better than himself. Right? And he goes on to say, do you think he would strike his own mother, so long dear and necessary to him, for the sake of some new darling, not necessary at all, who has become his mistress? Would he strike his own father, an old man in his later years, necessary to him and most ancient of all dear friends, for the sake of a pretty youth, but newly his dear and not necessary at all? Would he make them both slaves and subject them to these others, bringing these into the same house? Yes, by God, said he. A most blessed thing it seems to be to have a tyrannical son. And so he's talking about the sacrifice of the past, that all those things that were hallmarks of who he was, his father, his mother, his elders, all being sacrificed for this pursuit of the new, for this acquisition of the new, of some new beauty,
Right.
of some new opinion, of some new thing, right? He then continues to say, then what will happen when such a man finds the goods of his parents beginning to fail him, and there is all that swarm of pleasures collected within him? Surely he will first get in touch with some house wall, or the cloak of someone, walking about late at night, and then sweep clean a temple or so. And all the while, the beliefs which he had from boyhood about what is beautiful and ugly, which were held to be right and just, will be mastered by those lately emancipated from slavery, aided by the ruling passions whose bodyguard they are, those that used to be let loose in the vision of sleep, when he was under law himself and under his father, still democratic in himself. But now, under the tyranny of the ruling passion, he becomes always in broad daylight, such as he used to be now and then in dreams. He will abstain from no dreadful deed, no murder, no forbidden food. That passion lives in him as a tyrant, so sovereign alone, with no government or law to restrain it. And so it will lead the man, whom it occupies like a conquered city, into every audacity by which it can support both itself and the racket of desires around it, partly introduced from without from evil company, and partly let loose at liberty from within by similar habits, and by the tyrant passion itself. Is not this the life of such a man?
Mm-hmm.
And we begin to, if we haven't already, begin to see what Socrates believes a constitution and a city is supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
A city is meant to rule men,
Right.
to restrain his worst self.
Mm-hmm.
That's what governments and laws are meant to do. And we've often, like we said before, that a city isn't supposed to crush the human spirit but
Right.
embolden it. It's supposed to make someone more free.
Right.
It's supposed to give them, more flexibility. It's
Mm-hmm.
supposed to give them everything that they need to be a human being, which
Mm-hmm.
is something that does not exist in nature.
Mm-hmm.
Those ideals are not compatible when you have to compete with, the lions and
Right.
bears of the wild.
Mm-hmm.
But it's in our own biome, in
Mhm.
society, in our own artificial reality, where we can truly be human.
Mm-hmm.
Not to Plato though.
Mm-hmm.
The city that Plato sees,
Mhm.
the government that Plato understands, is one that restrains
Right.
the baser instincts of humanity to allow for the greater, reasoning
Right.
parts of the human condition
Mm-hmm.
to take hold.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we said, we have a fundamental disagreement
Right.
on the role the city is supposed to undertake.
Mm-hmm.
And he says about, let me see, about what is beautiful and ugly, right?
Mm-hmm.
He has these ideals of the beauty of his present,
Mm-hmm.
of all those things that he held close are
Mm-hmm.
now once again being sacrificed for his relentless pursuit of his own desires. Now let's take a moment here. Let's take a moment. Because in reading this, we've often talked about cognitive dissonance. We've often talked about cognitive dissonance. It's funny how Plato can see the tyrant
Right.
in his pursuit of his own singular goals, which comes at the cost of everything that he knows to be beautiful and everything that he holds to be right. That so nothing becomes forbidden to him.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing becomes taboo. Nothing is off the table. He will open himself up to anything if that means it brings him closer to his own desires. Now look at Plato.
Mm-hmm.
Look at Socrates. Look at the city he's trying to build.
Mm-hmm.
His aristocracy. You can't play particular types of music.
Right.
Your children aren't even your own. So you talk about how the tyrant destroys parents.
Right.
What about what you're doing?
Mm-hmm.
There's no such thing as parents in your society.
Right.
Children are property of the state.
Mm-hmm.
So there is no parent, no mother, no father. All that's gone.
Mm-hmm.
You say that the tyrant abuses these ideas, you've utterly destroyed them. And with your temples, how the tyrant goes after the temples, all those things that are beautiful, right? Aren't you the one censoring your own beliefs?
Yeah. You're censoring your great writers, your great historians. You've even censored your gods, basically. Yes. You've decided that you have decided that the best education is that of training warriors, to the point to where you will bring children out onto the battlefield to test blood, so that they are always warrior-like in their pursuits. These are the things that you have limited your people to. You're the tyrant. The city that you're
Yes.
creating is tyrannical. And it's all in benefit of that one group.
Yes. You talk about you like say you censored God.
Mm-hmm.
You censor your own gods.
Even particular
You
music,
said
colors,
that
everything.
God
Right.
can only be good.
Mm-hmm.
Even but are you an artist?
Right.
Are you a poet? It's no.
Right.
Plato has made the distinction, like we read earlier on with Ion.
Right.
He made the clear distinction between a philosopher
And a poet.
because a poet doesn't really know anything. Like he said,
Right.
all they have is right opinion. They don't know anything.
Mm-hmm.
But the philosopher, his whole business is knowing.
Right.
Is knowing for certain and saying what can be known, what is and what is not.
Mm-hmm.
You aren't a poet.
Mm-hmm.
The poet is the poet. And like you said, the poet
is the
closest link
right, to God.
To God.
Mm-hmm.
It gets all their ideals from divine dispensation.
That's right.
That's what you said,
right?
Socrates, Plato.
Right. Mm-hmm.
That's what you said.
Mm-hmm.
So who knows better the will of these gods than the poets?
Mm-hmm.
So if the poet said that Zeus did this thing, that Zeus's nature is like this,
right.
that Athena and Ares and all of the gods, they act like this. If that's what the poets say, and they're the closest through divine dispensation, what gives you the right to then say that they're wrong? When you aren't even when you're
not even on the link, right?
You're not even
on the
in the conversation.
That's right. Sounds familiar,
right? No, because you're the philosopher,
right? And
so all right? So who's ransacking the temples now?
Mm-hmm. We know it's not the poet.
You are.
You are.
They said you got your own state-run eugenics program.
Right.
You're talking about when only particular people can breed in your city.
Right.
And that we need to make sure that those that we don't want don't breed. And since they can't breed, we have to make sure we lie to them so they think that it's their fault and not the city's fault.
Right. And if we have to give them medicines to curb whatever urges they may have, then we could do that as well.
That's the rule of the best, right?
Right.
That's aristocracy.
Mm-hmm.
Your best city.
Mm-hmm.
Doing the exact same thing that your tyrant is doing.
Right.
But your tyrant is doing it for themselves.
Right.
But your king is doing it for the city.
Right.
For society as a whole.
But even in his rule, because what's best for him is what's best for the city state, right? That's the tyrant. If it's best for him, then of course it's best for everyone else. Right? I mean, it's the same thing. But I guess, being a tyrant, that takes on a different connotation than an aristocrat.
Than a king.
I'm sorry.
These are the two ideas. And this is what Plato says about the tyrant and the king.
Mm-hmm.
Is it true then that whoever shall be proved the most wicked will also be proved the most miserable? And whoever is tyrant longest and most fully will be most and longest miserable in truth? There are many different opinions about this. So much at least, he said, must certainly be true. Then surely the tyrannical man would be in one likeness with the city under a tyrant, and the democratical man with the city under democracy, and so with all the others. Why, what else? Then what city is to a city as to virtue and happiness? That man is to man, of course. And what in respect of virtue is a city under a tyrant compared with a city under a king, as we have first described it? Exactly the opposite. For one is best, the other worse. I will not ask which is which, for that is clear, but is happiness or misery? Do you judge in the same way or not? And don't let us be dismayed by keeping our eyes on that one man, the tyrant, or the few he may have about him. We must dive into every part of the city and see it as a whole, and then give our opinion. A fair challenge. Everyone can see that no city is more miserable than under a tyrant, and none happier than under a king.
Well, see, the tyrant's attitude, I guess, his wants and needs are insatiable. But with the king, I guess because of his reasoning, right?
Mm-hmm.
That he would be able to, you know, put a halt to his own satiations.
Yeah.
That he wouldn't go overboard, because with the tyrant, he goes overboard and he's miserable. He always has to have more.
Mm-hmm.
But the king, he will always be in better judgment. He'll be able to reason that it's not about him, but it's for the city state.
Yeah.
And so that's where we get into what you're practically saying the same thing for both.
Well, and we also need to remember how Plato defines happiness.
Yes. Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Happiness to him is the farmer being able to farm,
Right.
the craftsman being able to craft,
right,
and the ruler being able to rule.
Mm-hmm.
That, like I said, he can't, like I said, he seems to not understand that farmers aren't real.
Right.
That it's just people.
Mm-hmm.
And that people may farm,
Right.
right, but they may not be farmers.
Mm-hmm.
They may be farmed, but they want to do other things and
right.
be other people. They
Mm-hmm.
may just farm as a means to an end.
Right.
Because they have to
Mm-hmm.
provide food so they can eat.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Plato doesn't understand it.
Right.
To him, the farmer wants to farm.
Right. And he doesn't want
to do anything but be a farmer.
Right.
And as long as the king is able to provide for everything for the farmer to be a farmer, he'll be happy. So since his city is happiest, is the happiest of all cities,
right?
Because the king is best able to provide what everyone needs so they can do the work that needs to be done to maintain the health of the city as a whole.
So what the king has is order. He's able to maintain a particular type of order, right? The farmer gets what the farmer needs, according to what the king is able to provide.
What the king says that the farmer needs.
Right. And for the tyrant, well,
the tyrant provides nothing.
That's right. He needs.
But for himself.
That's right.
And you're everything that he does is to boast of that.
Right. It's to boast of himself versus the maintenance of the city.
So like we said, like you say, we have a very different idea of what a city is, or what happiness is even. Your king only provides for the farmer, but not for the people.
Right.
Do you see how this fails?
Right.
You see where it all begins to fall apart? Not to mention that your city's culture is not about the farmer.
Right.
It's not about everyone.
That's right.
Your city's culture is about your aristocracy. It's about your best, quote unquote. Your city's culture is about the silver and gold. Everything else is meant to just underpin that.
That's
so
right.
Like we said before, your farmer, your craftsman, and your doctors, all of them, they're living in a warrior culture, in an aristocratic culture. A culture that probably does not prioritize their needs. They're not listening to the types of music that you said are bad because it makes your rulers weak. They're not, hearing all the poems. They're getting afraid of different ideals of their gods and history in and of itself. They don't get to raise their own kids.
Right.
If they even get to have them.
Right.
Your entire city has prioritized the health of one group over everything else because you think the health of that one group can provide for everybody else. But a cultural fixation that completely ignores the desires of one group for the desires of the other. How is that not oligarchy?
Right.
How is that not the rule of one group?
Right.
The rule of groups, the rule of that. How is that not?
It's tyranny.
How is that not tyranny?
Right.
And since that one group, since the state owns all the property, and only a particular people get to rule in said state, don't they own all the property then? Wouldn't that make them oligarchs?
Right.
How is this any different?
Right.
Your tyrant, like you said, tyranny is just a more honest aristocracy.
Exactly.
It seems.
Yeah.
It's not tyrant versus king.
Right.
The tyrant and king aren't two opposing ideas
Right.
on two separate ends of the spectrum.
Right.
The tyrant and king on the same side of the spectrum.
Right. Because the king and the tyrant comes from the same place.
Mm-hmm. Trying to perfect society.
That's it. And
whether they're trying to perfect it for the kingdom as a
right.
whole or trying to perfect it for themselves,
right.
their position is always set in stone.
Yeah, the tyrant is, the person who was silver and gold.
The tyrant is the person who has to take power.
Yes.
Right?
That's
has
right.
to take power.
And
whereas the king is the one who inherits it.
That's it. So what are we talking about here? What are we talking about?
The same
it's
power
still the same thing.
It's still the same dynamic
right. Mm-hmm.
between ruler and ruled. Mm-hmm. And and between rulers and those that are ruled.
Ooh, right.
It's still the same interplay of forces.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to create okay. Now say that your king, there's an off season, there's a drought,
right?
Right. And your king cannot provide what the farmer needs. Mm-hmm. Will the farmer not look at that king and then say, "Well, that king is a failure. That king is an oligarch"?
And I tell you what, the farmer may be suffering from this drought. I guarantee you the king won't. The king will eat every day. The king
the king needs to eat every day.
That's what I'm saying. See,
everything that needs to
right.
do.
So you
so when the farmer says the king is failing
right.
to provide for his freedom,
right.
for his way of life,
mm-hmm.
who is that person going to turn to?
Right.
Maybe there's another dissenting voice in your government that mm-hmm. says, I've been pushed out too. The king isn't being able to drive me, back me,
right.
and I'll be able to get you what you want.
Right.
That's literally how you say tyranny comes about.
Yeah. Even though, he mentions, how all of these different constitutions and governments produce, mm-hmm. Produce the oligarch, the democratic man, the tyrant or whatever. But they all come from that silver and gold place. Mm-hmm. They're not coming from the bottoms.
From the bronze.
That's from the They're not coming from the bronze. They're coming from the silver and gold. And like I mentioned before, I'm like, this sounds like rich people problems here.
And another thing that we want to touch on here. Mm-hmm. Another thing here. Plato let's say he talks about control, talks about self-control, and he talks about how people mm-hmm. fail to live up
right.
to these things. Mm-hmm. And in examining the city, he's examining people
right.
and the problems with people. Mm-hmm. But the problem is, mm-hmm. by your very own metric, the people didn't create the city.
That's right. They didn't create this problem.
Your constitution did. Your government did. Mm-hmm. Your rulers did. Mm-hmm. So that city is not a reflection of the people.
Right.
It's a reflection of your rulers.
Sounds familiar?
So when you're examining all these different cities, when you're examining the democratic city and how it reflects upon the soul of mm-hmm. man and stuff like that, you can't even begin to extrapolate about the people who actually live in those things.
Right.
You have to deal with that.
Right.
You can only, even if you want to do that, extrapolate about the people who implement.
Like Amos Wilson said, if you want to see why a problem persists, you don't see who suffer from it. You look at those who benefit. And it's the same sort of vision that we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. The problems of the city-state is not because of, I'm going to say the poor. I'm just going to just generalize. Because of the bronze, the poor, the farmer, the craftsman, or whatever.
And
that's not the issue.
That's where he believes the tyrant comes from.
But the tyrant doesn't come from it.
He keeps talking about how the poor end up, the weak end up ruling the strong, right. and all that stuff. As if the tyrant comes from out. Like I said, what the tyrant does, mm-hmm. what makes the tyrant a tyrant, mm-hmm. is that person, and he even says it here in himself, that the tyrant doesn't believe in anything. Mm-hmm. The tyrant doesn't have any friends. The tyrant doesn't have any faith.
Right.
The tyrant only cares about satisfying his own desires.
Right.
And anything that gets him closer to that, that's what he would do.
Right.
So he doesn't have any beliefs. Right. He doesn't have any opinions or knowledge at all. He mm-hmm. doesn't have anything.
Right.
Right?
He's a populist for sure.
A demagogue.
Yes, a demagogue. Better word. Right.
So if you look at the metric that you've set up here, mm-hmm. your society is a reflection of the tyrant. Mm-hmm. If you want to examine the society, you end up examining the people, who run it.
Right.
But you want to extrapolate from the city the people who don't have a say.
Right.
and say that that's a reflection of them.
Right.
Like I've said before that if you want to recognize the health of your society, look at your city.
Right.
If your city is poor, if your city has homelessness, crime, and all this, then there is something at large, a problem at large in your society as a whole. That a city is the best barometer for the health of your society.
Right. Folk at the top are not doing their job.
Your people, the people, are not necessarily a reflection of your city, but the reflection of the consequence of living there.
Right.
If you want to examine the souls of people, right, you can't liken it to a city.
Right.
Right, or to the failures of government. But like for Plato, who's very top down, that's all he can see.
Right.
Like you said, you look at it top down, but yet your problems come from the people and it's bottom up. See that's cognitive dissonance. Yeah. That's a contradiction. Doesn't make any sense.
It's chump shit. That's what I call it. Chump.
Doesn't make any sense.
Right. You know,
if everything is implemented from the top down,
how can it be their problem from the bottom up?
How can tyranny come from the bottom up? How can tyranny come from the people?
Yeah, we talked about this. I'm like, this doesn't make any sense whatsoever. I'm like, think of a tyrant. 21st century, whatever. Think of
pick one.
Pick one. And tell me where he comes from, because most likely the tyrant will be a man. Where does he come from? What's his class? What's his family? What's all this? They're not coming from down here. They're from the silver and gold ranks. Yes, they may be propped up, and I mentioned we talked about this before. Yeah, they may be propped up by the bronze.
Yeah,
because the tyrant knows what to say and when to say it, and how to feed off of the bronze.
And society is failing the people at the very bottom.
Yeah,
right. So someone at the very top acts upon that angst,
right,
and uses that, even though they don't really believe in anything.
Right,
they don't really care. They're only using it as an means to further their own goals.
Right, and the tyrant, even though he may be propped up by the bronze, but he feeds off of all y'all, particularly those at the top. That's what we think, because those at the top, they're in possession of what it is that the tyrant wants. He wants the position, he wants the power, he wants all that. So it's right there. And those who are, bronze, we're in that constant state of being victimized more than anything else. But the tyrant is not from, the bottom dredges, or however you want to describe it. They're from, the rich,
so
the well-to-do. Right.
Plato draws this dichotomy. Between the tyrant and the king. He places them on two opposite ends of the spectrum.
Right.
But like we said, that cognitive dissonance, where his aristocracy is basically doing everything that a tyranny would do.
Right.
Right? But let's say aristocracy is merely just an artifice.
It's a color.
It's just pretty tyranny.
Yeah, that's it. I just mentioned, it sounds better. It sounds better than a tyrant.
When really,
it's
the same.
Yeah.
They're one and the same.
Right. Form over function, right? Empire sounds better than tribal wars. But the result is the same. You're still fighting.
You're failing.
And you're failing. But to say that, empire, that we have empires that fight, that fought too.
There is this one final statement that Plato says about tyrants as a whole before he ends up shifting the discussion.
All right.
He says, "So in very truth, whatever anyone may think, the real tyrant is a real slave to all coaxings and slaveries of the basest. He must flatter the most worthless of mankind, and never can satisfy his own desires in the least. No, he stands in direst need of most things, and turns out to be truly a pauper. If one knows how to estimate the soul as a whole, all his life laden with fear, he is full of spasms and pains. If his condition indeed is like the city he rules, and he is like it, isn't he?" Now that's dead on.
Yeah, he's spot on right now.
That's right. That's very correct. That's very correct.
Yeah.
And most tyrants, if not all tyrants, are, as he said, paupers.
Yes.
liars.
Have to constantly look over your shoulders. Constantly. As a matter of fact, they're around here making up scenarios. They're knocking off and doing things to other folk who they think just might be a threat to them. They're acting preemptively without any, with nothing, just a thought. So yeah.
So yes,
he is miserable.
All he can ever be.
That's all he can do. That's right.
So yeah. Now Plato wants to begin to talk about what you would say, his greater point. His greater point about, I think he says not since the let me see if I can find it. He begins because his whole thing is about philosophers should be rulers, philosophers should be kings, right. And all that stuff. And he says here, let me see. Since there is dispute then about the pleasures of each class and the life of each class, not only which leads to the more beautiful or ugly existence, or the better or worse, but which indeed is more pleasant and free from pain, how could we know which of them speaks most truly? Right? And the thing that he's touching on here is that he has, much like how he's broken down everything, he's now breaking down the soul of men. Right? He's doing that again from back in book 6, 7, one of those books, right, where he started to break down the layers of the soul, where he put the reasoning as the very highest, right, and the opinion is on the other side of the spectrum, and then there is intuition and stuff like that lies in the middle. Right. Once again, he's breaking down the order of men into three categories. The soul into three categories. There's the wisdom lover, the honor lover, and the gain lover, the profit lover. Yep. And so once again, he's trying to, trying to ask which one of those is best. Right? Which one of those is we know it's going to be wisdom. Let's follow his argument here. Well, look at it this way. What must we judge by if we are to judge properly? Surely experience and intelligence and reason. Could one find a better standard than those? How could one? Said he. Just think now. Here are three men. Which is most experienced in all the pleasures we mention? Has the gain lover more experience of the pleasure of knowledge by striving to learn the nature of truth than a philosopher has of the pleasure that comes from gain? There is a great difference, he said. The philosopher must have tasted the other pleasures from boyhood up, but there is no necessity for the gain lover to learn the real nature of things, or to taste and gain experience of that pleasure, and to know how sweet it is. Indeed, he would not find it easy even if he tried. Then there's a great difference, I said. The philosopher also passes the gain lover in experience of both pleasures. Yes, far, said he. And how does he compare with the honor lover? Which has more experience, the philosopher of the pleasure of being honored, or the honor lover of the pleasure of being wise? The truth is, he said, that if they each accomplish their aims, honor follows them all. For the rich man is honored by many, and so is the brave man, and so is the wise man. Thus all have experience of the pleasure which comes from honor. But how great is the pleasure of contemplating things as they are, none but the philosopher can ever taste. Then, as far as experience goes, he is the best judge in the world, far the best. And besides, his experience alone has intelligence with it, undoubtedly. And further, the instrument through which judgment must be made belongs to the philosopher, not the gain lover, nor the honor lover. What instrument? Reasoning through words, we said, ought to be the way of judging, didn't we? Yes, and words are chiefly the philosopher's instruments. Of course. Well, if the things judged were best judged by riches and gain, the judgment of the gain lover in praise or blame would necessarily be most true, undoubtedly. And if it were by honor and victory and bravery, the honor lover and the victory lover would judge most truly. That is clear. But since it is by experience and wisdom and reasoning, then necessarily, said he, the praise of the philosopher, the lover of wisdom and words, must be most true. Once again, putting philosophers on a pedestal here by saying that wisdom entails honor and profit. Right. Profit does not entail wisdom, and honor does not entail wisdom. But the wise man has experience of both honor and profit to some extent, and the real profit, the profit of the soul.
So, right, profit of the soul.
Right. And even more, has experience of the love of wisdom, and is able to take pleasure in contemplating, as he said here, contemplated things as they are. Right. So Plato is saying here is that only the wise man can judge.
Right.
Right. Only the wise man could judge, even though wise men don't judge.
That's right. Because he deals with things as they are.
Yes. And honor loving and money loving does not preclude wisdom.
That's right.
You know, it is possible. I know that, you know, it's hard to see.
Right. But it's possible. Right.
For a rich person to be wise and honorable. For an honorable person to be rich and wise. These things don't make the others impossible.
Right.
By your very own logic.
Right.
You have to, you know, the wise man, but you said the wise man knows both wisdom and profit.
Well, how does he know that?
Right. So what about, I can say the exact same thing about the rich man. He knows about honor and wisdom. That's what makes him rich.
Yeah.
I can say the same thing about the general who knows about, you know, profit and wisdom. That's why he's the general.
Right.
Like, I can see, like, you're
going,
just choosing. You're just choosing whatever thing. You know, and it doesn't really mean anything. And not to mention that, like I say, like, by your own admission, philosophers do not want to rule.
Right.
Philosophers do not stand in judgment. Right?
Right. They only just say what things are.
They understand the pleasure of contemplating things as they are. They did not stand in judgment of reality, but understanding of it. They may want it to be something else, but they don't judge it.
Right.
That's not what wise people do.
Right. Duh.
By your own admission.
Right.
Right? So if you're making the philosopher a ruler, then you are blunting his wisdom.
But if he has the wisdom, you know, and he's the philosopher, then he wouldn't
want to rule. By your own
Yes, by your own right.
So if you make the philosopher the ruler, what is he losing then?
Right.
The wisdom, the experience, all the things that you said made him best able to rule.
Because you don't need philosophy to rule.
You said many times before. These things.
We're going in circles here, right?
These things are not. They don't need each other.
Right.
Kings don't need to be wise.
Right.
And philosophers are not kings. That's what makes them philosophers. If you make the philosopher a judge, if you make the philosopher a ruler, then you limit the wisdom that they are able to attain. They cannot contemplate things as they are. They can only judge it and rule it. Thus, not making them philosophers anymore.
We're trying not to sound like a broke record here.
Here we
go. Keep saying it, right?
Mainly because, like, you run up against that same barrier again and again, and like by your own
admission,
logic, by your own logic, by the way you set up the argument, you are showing the fallacy in your own logic here. But like I said, he keeps going, right, and he ends up trying to talk about. He keeps going, and he ends up trying to talk about the soul even further, about how the soul is divided, right? Let me see. There's a lot here.
It is.
Let me see. I think I may have lost my place.
Yeah, let's look on. Are you talking about the?
Oh no, I got it.
Okay, all right. Okay.
It was the last paragraph. I was looking over it,
and I literally have last paragraph written down.
Yeah. All right. Now let us answer the person who says it pays this man to be unjust, and it is not profitable to him to do justice. Tell him that he is simply saying it pays to feed up his multiform monster, and by so doing make the lion and all about it stronger, but to starve the man inside and make him weak, so as to be dragged wherever either of the other leads him, and not make either of them friends of each other and intimates, but leave all the creatures to bite and fight and eat each other. So, what Plato was saying, he's gone back to his old argument that that injustice is more profitable than justice.
Right.
What he just said is that if you break down the soul, like he said many times before, to the honor loving, which he likens to a
The
lion,
yeah.
and the profit loving, which he honors, what he makes into like a multi-headed,
The
hydra type
yeah.
monster. And then there's the wisdom, which is the man, right? If you are following injustice, and if you say injustice is more profitable, you're saying that injustice is more profitable for the lion, or no, for the monster inside, right? For those parts, for the honor loving, for the profit loving. But for the wise part, the real part, the highest, most cherished part of the human being, it does him no profit at all, because it breaks up himself. He loses control and becomes subject to the whims of his inner beast instead of being able to control it. Right? That's his main argument. And we once again touch upon the same thing that we've said many times before about a thing and seeing how it moves with everything else. You can't take the soul of a person out of context, right?
Right.
The beast and the man and the divine, how he puts it, right? That the divine part is the wisdom. The man is the prophet. The beast is the honor.
How do you want to line it up, right?
The wisdom is the highest. However, the other two doesn't really matter.
Right.
The wisdom is divine. It's the otherworldly, the ineffable. You want to break all of those things up and say that we need to prioritize the wisdom, right? And use your wisdom to control everything else. So, like we said, to the exclusion of all other things.
Yeah, but how do you
ends up creating the exact same cycle that you think you're curtailing.
Yeah, but how do you grow on wisdom? It has to be. It's in concert with your life, with experience.
And you can't.
So you can't take it out of those things.
Define.
Yeah, you can't take it out.
Humanity in conflict of itself. The beast, all that part is it's a necessary asset. It's a part of who we are. It's not about imposing control on these things. It's about finding a way to use these things that is most conducive to everyone else. You're not controlling the human spirit. You're working with it. You're not running in contra. You're not trying to defeat it. You're not in conflict with yourself. But that's the whole thing. Your whole metric is control the inner beast.
Yeah. Trying in your attempts to try to control, to try to defeat, those things are creating the city state and the problems that you think that you are going to avoid. In actuality, you're creating all of your problems.
You're ensuring it.
Ensuring, yes, that's a better word. That's what you're doing, because you're not allowing for the movement that people need, that people have.
How these parts of the soul, however you want to break it up, how the honor lover, the prophet lover, and the wisdom lover, how those things relate to each other is what makes us human. Right. If you want to break it up that way. Right. How they relate to one another makes them human. It's not about ruling yourself. Right. With an iron fist. Right. To make sure that the wise, that's a tyrannical man. As a tyrannical man. Right. A person who isn't working with themselves, working from their own basis. Right, they're working against themselves. They're working in conflict with themselves to the exclusion of that one part of themselves that they desire and treasure the most. That's a tyrannical man. It's literally what you're doing. We're not, how all these things relate to each other. That's where humanity comes from. You can't break it up. You can't, like I said, you can't take something out of its context and try to see it in and of itself. It doesn't exist in and of itself. Right. It exists in concert with everything else. So what your entire idea of what a city is, what the tyrant is, that's exactly what you say it is. You're right. The tyrant is someone who does not believe in anything. Right. Someone who is willing to sacrifice anything in slavish pursuit of their own desires. Someone who prioritizes their own well-being over anything to the exclusion of everything else. And who would do absolutely anything with no regard for themselves or for anyone else to achieve their goals. Right.
which is insatiable, by the way.
Yes,
Yes.
which is insane, which is bottomless,
Right.
so can never actually be satiated.
Mm-hmm.
You are absolutely right. But that line that you draw in the sand
Mm-hmm.
between the tyrant and the king and the souls of men, that's where it all breaks down.
Right.
Because your tyrant and your king are on the same end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
That greater
They're not opposite
man,
ends. That's right.
the greater man that
Mhm.
you're trying to describe, is on the same side of the spectrum as your tyrannical man.
Mm-hmm.
It's all feeding into itself.
Mm-hmm.
And you're creating the type of atmosphere that you think that you're alleviating, but you can't see it
Mm-hmm.
because you're caught up in the artifice of aristocracy.
Right. And you're thinking that the king would have a temperament, you know, and would temper his actions, unlike the tyrant who just goes for all. But the thing is that even for the king who you claim or who you think will be able to temper, that's all in conflict with his rule. Because whatever it is that he needs is what allows him to rule. And that's pretty much the exact same thing
Mm-hmm.
with a tyrant. And that the tyrant, like we mentioned, the tyrant and the king, they come from the same place. And that to judge a city on, I'm going to say, the bronze or the poor or the worst of it is
no judgment at all.
Is no judgment at all. As a matter of fact, I would just say you're wrong. Because what is being imposed upon the bronze, the poor, that comes from the top. So any result of that is the result in the failures of the top, not those at the bottom. And I know that just sounds familiar, but here we are.
So yes, that was book 9,
Mm-hmm.
penultimate episode. The discussion of the tyrannical man
Mm-hmm.
and the idea of the tyrant versus the king.
Mm-hmm.
Like we said in conclusion, all these things are related to each other. Plato thinks he's drawing a distinction, but he's actually drawing a comparison.
That's right.
So yeah, if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comments. And once again, thank you for hearing us out.
Thank you.